Thank you everyone for being here, for your participation in the trip to date. I will say a personal thank you. I have learned so much from each of you, the different conversations, the questions when we're at the field and I finally see permafrost and I'm like, don't make us leave. And yet recognize those are the kind of moments I think each of us may have had in a different way, understanding from an engineering perspective why the ecologist is worried, why someone will call this a different type of sediment or soil, and someone's going to consider about how the vegetation will root in that, et cetera. The office that Chel and I, Rebecca, sit in within DOT is the policy office. We come into this both being engaged in various types of policy. I come at from the PhD scientist role, where I've worked with Department of Interior, National Park Service. Chel has also worked with Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management. So we do have a set of slides here, but we're going to do our best to personalize it to what you have seen this week, what you've heard this week, and these different connections that we need to continue to make after our time here up in the Arctic and here in Fairbanks. So we've had different people here. Yeah, this slide is fine. We've seen a variety of things from different perspectives. So we recognize someone may look at a port from one perspective and others may be looking at it, is there sediment around? What's it going to do to turbidity? What's it going to do to the aquatic organisms, the fish? Will there be algae? Will there be erosion? There are a whole variety of considerations. So we have backgrounds here from engineers to ecologists to planners. And yes, we represent policy, but I want you to know that some of us come to policy from different backgrounds, and we're hoping to share some of that with you here today. But we recognize whether you're on the Dalton, who remembers where this location is? Yeah. Okay, would you like to describe it, Billy, for those who weren't able to see that site?
Okay, 1 minute. The flow is starting way up here in a cirque and is basically riding on a film of water coming down at very high pressures because of the weight of the soil above it. And as you can see, it has encroached on the highway. The Department of Transportation, after some hours of discussion, standing right about here with DOT folks and Ronnie and others, basically just DOT decided to cut and run, and they built a roadway over here. So that's the 1 minute summary.
Thank you, Billy. I just want to say, so at DOT, our role isn't always to be the expert. So you figured out I don't have to be the expert all the time in any given topic, right? We have a lot of people here who are working on a variety of reports. It may be the university transportation centers. It may be other collaborations we have with other agencies. But just know some of the biggest things we have to do are to follow our strategic goals. And so organizational excellence, so we all want to do that, right? That's not what we're talking about here today. Transformation, we're certainly talking about transformation because here we're dealing with permafrost in many locations, but we also heard if you have an airport, you want it to last for 20 years, whether it's the runway or the other associated infrastructure. Climate sustainability, that is exactly why we're here today. Equity, Chel's going to focus on that just a bit more here at the end of our talk. Economic strength, global competitiveness, we've talked about that a lot. Why is the Arctic so strategic? Why is DOT clearly engaged? Why are a variety of other federal departments clearly engaged? Why are you engaged as a local resident, citizen, Alaskan by heart? And also safety. We saw safety, and this is when I need to acknowledge our DOT guides from yesterday. We had pilot cars. We had Matt and Jeff on the bus at different times. So just want to make sure we extend the thank you to everyone who's been here to help facilitate these conversations. Next slide. The bipartisan infrastructure law. You've heard that. You may have heard Inflation Reduction Act. So we basically have a large variety of funding sources that have come through and somewhat unprecedented for this particular point in our lifetimes. There is a tremendous amount of funding in some of these. $550 billion in new federal infrastructure investment. So you've seen some of the additional construction in certain locations. I don't think you've traveled anywhere in the country and not dealt with construction in certain location. Also, first climate title and new climate-focused transportation programs. So we actually have ones that have climate in the need for these programs. Protect, these are resilience grants. There's a carbon reduction program, charging and fueling infrastructure, National Electric Vehicle Formula Program, we mentioned that, but we also talked here why it's so challenging to have electric vehicles up on the North Slope. And so recognize some of these programs have a different focus in different areas of the country. Okay, I'll have to go off my notes then. We also heard of other grants, and I'll mention that because I think this is particularly relevant to the borough, because they were mentioning some of the tribal resilience funding. Please keep us here as resources, and you look at for these grants, whether it's for Wainwright, some of us had a time to be on the ground in Point Lay, Utiavik, and Wainwright. Some of us have different types of expertise. Reach out if you have a particular question about those sites as you go forward and compete for that funding, and I encourage you to compete for funding. The Climate Action Plan is something that clearly came before both, well, it was actually during some of Chel's time and my time. We both started as detailees, trying to give Department of Transportation a trial run before we moved over. And so they decided they liked us, they invited us to come over, so we're over there permanently. But within the Climate Action Plan, there are a few key things we need to do. Use best available scientists, use available science. You're the scientist, you're providing the science, and thank you for that. Prioritize the most vulnerable. Once again, I'll point to Chel and some of our observations from Utiavik for that work. Preserve ecosystems. Have to give Lorene a shout out, Bill, others who've clearly worked on the ecological side of this component of the ecosystem, the biological component where we spend a lot of time on the physical ice, sediment, soil, rock, but ecosystem has both biological and physical components. Building community relationships. This is this community that we're working on right now, but also adaptation and resilience require coordination across multiple sectors. We won't be successful if we don't work together. And then engage globally. Next slide. All right, we do have key plans, key components to our climate action plan, adaptation and resilience. This is the stuff we do on a daily basis if you wonder what we actually do when we're not going along in a bus and asking questions about permafrost lenses, et cetera. We are incorporating resilience and into DOT grant and loan programs. We're enhancing resilience throughout the project planning and development process. We were asked to talk about planning, but we're really trying to take this information and move it forward. We're ensuring resiliency of DOT's facilities and operational assets. There are many other people doing this much more on the ground. We've talked a lot about O&M. If you don't, operations, maintenance, there's a lot of things that have to happen on the ground. Climate ready services and supplies, as well as climate education and research. Next slide. Discretionary grants are a very important part, and this is where I'm bringing forward some resources that can help you with your applications. On the right side, we developed a checklist for strong climate change mitigation. This is one of my first products, truly with DOT, that I helped author. There are two core components of a strong project focused on the mitigation component, the adaptation and resilience features within that. And these checklists help you with some of that information. There are a wide variety of resources that have been provided by federal highways. Examples may include information on nature-based solutions, structures, et cetera. Some of that work has been done through federal highways. There are a whole variety of hydraulic engineering information, but I also heard we do have a clear place where we're challenged in terms of our engineering design standards, and recognize there is a lot of work behind the scenes with ASCE and others, AASHTO, et cetera. There's some engineering and transportation acronyms if they're not your background. I'm not going to go into all of those, but also recognize this protect. This is up to 848 million of funds that are being made available, and it's specific to add resilience to projects. Applications are due pretty soon, so maybe a little short timeline for some people, but recognize these funding programs are out here and please apply. Next slide. There are a variety of programs and projects. And the biggest thing is we heard the need to be part of the change. And to do that, providing the information for the change, you have to rely on information that exists, but recognize anyone who knows these reports have been in progress, some of these 3-5 years, et cetera, but that information is there. But I think many people in the room are going to be so involved in creating the new information that we need. One of the things people ask what I've been doing, and then I'm going to turn this over to Chel, is a DOT climate resilience review and gap assessment. So I'm looking across the different modes of transportation. Marine administration, that's our ports. Working across highways. We've driven on some of those in various forms this week, but also looking at climate information, education, operations, and workforce. So what are we actively doing for climate? Where are the gaps? What's needed? and international as well. Next slide. We do have research in different areas, but I also think it's really important that we talk about resilience and disaster recovery. We haven't really had as much a focus on that on some of our topics, but I will say how we recover from a disaster is key for many of these areas. And in terms of transportation, asset risk, and resilience, we have different manuals, we have different reports, we have Transportation Review Board. And with that, I think we have one more slide on education. You can go forward. Yes, we do have various education resources, training DOT employees in terms of climate change, but also recognize there are other resources out there available on climate change education. Next, because I think it's.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I wished I could have been on the tour with you. I did say in our office, I was like, well, I live here, but I could always learn some things. So first of all, just to show of hands, how many were on the full tour? In other words, Uktiavik down. So most of you, okay. And how many of you this was completely new to you? You've never either been to Uktiavik or never have been on the Dalton Highway. So a few, okay. Excellent, excellent. Welcome. Well, first of all, and you probably heard this a million times over, but because I'm a Fairbanksan, I get to say this, welcome to the subarctic and the circumpolar north. And I'm really excited. It was fun. I saw it on paper when we were talking about who was going to go, and I saw it in the room today. Our circumpolar north neighbors are the most important thing we have as we look at the effects of climate and the effects of permafrost. As an Alaskan, as a Fairbanksan, I can say, and I often say it in our office, we have more in common with our partners in Yamal, in Samiland, in Greenland, and in Canada than we often do with our lower 48 compatriots. And I think you saw that today. A lot of it has to do with the human interaction with the land, what's happening at a global climate change level, and the fact that we are the front line, and our needs to extract resources to be a viable location. And so we learn a lot across boundaries, and that's really, really important. So why am I saying that right now? So as Rebecca mentioned, the bipartisan infrastructure law came about, and there was a great deal of funding available to study climate and to address the issues with climate. Most of it was focused, obviously, on the Department of Transportation. And the Department of Transportation rose to that occasion, decided to go out and find the best people they can to address those issues. Now, I don't want to pat ourselves on the back. We're not the best people. We're just good people. But what did that mean? That meant that they went out and they looked at other agencies. We both came to the U.S. Department of Transportation through open interagency details. I spent the last decade of my life here in Fairbanks working with the Bureau of Land Management, permitting some of the very same projects that you saw on the Dalton Highway. I also spent the last decade of my life working with Alaska Native villages and rural villages and interpreting and executing the law ANILCA, Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, as well as ANCSA, the Alaska Native Lands Settlement Act. So we have many layers of complication to how we address issues and how we integrate people's uses to the land. And as Rebecca mentioned, she comes with years of coastal resilience experience. So what does that mean for DOT? That means they coalesced groups of folks with those focuses to be able to address the needs that this particular administration and the challenge that this particular administration is put in front of to figure out how to handle climate and move our things forward. So US DOT, in addition to what Rebecca shared in our climate, we are also involved in a variety of other initiatives. Underneath bill, we call the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and IRA, which was the Inflation Reduction Act. Between both of those and the variety of executive orders signed under this current administration, there has been a challenge for all agencies of government to come together to address some of these climate initiatives. So that's where I come in. I take my background in social sciences and have been working on a lot of the subcommittees. So some of the subcommittees that may be of interest to you, and you may have colleagues that are working in them, or you may have questions about later, and I'd be happy to address them. Hold on, eyeballs. Age comes for us all, right? One of the ones that I think is worth mentioning is the Climate-Driven Relocation Subcommittee under the Coastal Resilience Interagency Working Group. So that is, it's housed under the White House Council of Native American Affairs and chaired by FEMA. And it's addressing the very issues that we're seeing in our communities in the North Slope, our communities in Western Alaska, our communities in interior Alaska, in which the primary drivers of the need to relocate is predominantly the effects of climate change. You can see, I think most people understood what happened with Typhoon Murbach, which happened to the western coastal villages, which were already experiencing a loss of their, well, they were experiencing extreme erosion and we're having flooding. But even here in interior Alaska, in Fort Yukon, which is a Gwich'in village, they are experiencing annual flooding at an increased rate such that it is actually carving away at the built infrastructure. So ADOT has got to look at moving the airport. We've got to look at relocating schools, et cetera, et cetera. And that is not an easy lift. So we have coalesced a variety of agencies to come together, put our minds together and figure out how we can come up with a climate-driven relocation national framework so that we could work with communities, get community voices. It's not easy. It's not easy to move people. It's not easy to relocate, just the logistics of relocation, the cost of relocation, and then the emotional toll of relocation. So USDOT is involved in that. We're also involved in the national strategy for the Arctic region as a primary agency, and that the national strategy was started in the Obama administration, and then again under this current administration had some further challenges. They have 4 pillars. The 4 pillars are security, climate change and environmental protection, sustainable economic development, and international cooperation and governance. And so we're an active partner in a couple of the strategic objectives, pursuing international initiatives to mitigate emissions in the Arctic and investments in infrastructure. A lot of those are port facilities, but we sit on that working group and participate and offer our expertise when we can. We also fund, and I think you talked about this a little bit, and I know Rebecca talked about it, but we fund the University Transportation funding for the Pac-10. So yeah. Okay. It's probably got an arm of UTC funding, but the debris lobe work that Margaret puts together, Margaret Darrow, that's part of UTC funding. So we're one of the interagencies that funds that to move that work forward. And Vicki would know on the our tribal transportation assistance program that's here, that is funded in part through DOT, and of course UAF is the strong partner there. And I'm not going to even try to describe it. I'll let you talk about that ad nauseum. That's also really important. We did have a member of our Deputy Secretary for Transportation for Tribal Affairs, Arlando Teller, was supposed to be on the symposium. He actually declined to attend because they are planning for a potential visit by the Secretary later this month, as well as a number of other tribal initiatives. So he's going to spend plenty of time here in Alaska at that time. But they just recently announced a tribal self-governance program. And I think that is an important element to the work that we're doing here, because it is putting funding directly in the hands of tribal institutions to be able to work directly to expend those funds rather than going through the grant process. So that's very, very important. And I think, I don't know if you had a chance to talk about that at all, about the need to be able to get direct funding, but that's critically important. Let me see. So that was our interagency groups to address climate resiliency, investments in transportation research. Look at that. We already got that. Online streamed information for funding opportunities. Okay, back down to equity, environmental justice, and access. It's one thing to have a massive infrastructure funding bill that dumps money everywhere. But as you saw when you traveled, and I'm sure many of you in the communities you work with, it becomes really difficult if you are a small community and you're just trying to figure out how to fix a problem, how to fix your port, how to address the roads that are experiencing weekly effects of permafrost melting. And so we recognized that and tried to come up with a streamlined option for small communities or any community. It's called the DOT Navigator. And it's a small thing, but I actually think it has a big effect because no longer will communities like the North Slope have to go through the pages to determine if it's an FHWA grant, if it's a MARAD grant, if it's an FRA grant, if it's an NSCF grant. They can go to one place. And that's critically important because a lot of these communities don't have the funds to put together a $150,000 grant application, nor do they have the staff to do it. So we tried to recognize that and to create an equitable environment so that people could access the resources that they needed to access. Additionally, US DOT put together a Thriving Communities program, and it's part of a network, again, interagency network. And the intent there is to match up smaller communities who have need, but have not traditionally been able to access infrastructure funds to address their problems. So for instance, we're looking at communities that might be a coalition of tribes. It could be a coalition of small rural communities, and they may only have a staff of 50 and they have a budget of 200,000. For them to be able to apply for a large grant is almost unattainable. So we created a simplified grant process so that they could get the technical assistance help that they needed to be able to be competitive for those larger grants. That's the Thriving Communities program. Lastly, and I realize we have other presentations, so I'll try to wrap it up. One of the other things that I've been working on with US DOT is how to understand what levels of, well, I should back it up. Executive Order 14008, which was signed earlier, or which addresses climate, also challenged all of the federal agencies to invest 40% of certain federal investments in disadvantaged communities. It's called the Justice 40 Initiative. And so we got busy. How do you define a disadvantaged community? So US DOT created a tool. It's called the Equitable Transportation Community Explorer, or the ETC Explorer, in which we used 40 indicators from existing federal data to be able to look at a community to determine any project area, the levels of disadvantage, particularly transportation disadvantage, that community was experiencing. And it's in 5 components. There's health vulnerability, social vulnerability, transportation insecurity, environmental burden, and climate and disaster burden. And what does that mean? That means that we could be looking at Fairbanks, we could be looking at Nenana, we could be looking at Uktiavik, and you can see real time what's happening with that particular census area or collections of census areas, so that you can actually write a proposal to address those burdens in the long run. That's different than a binary, it's disadvantaged or it's not disadvantaged. Our goal is to be able to understand and address the cumulative burden that these communities are experiencing and to actually address those burdens. So that's one of the big things that we've just come out with. I'd be happy to talk to folks offline a little bit about that tool. So let me see if there's anything else I had here. I think that's about it. That's probably good. So wrapping up, I think that, you know, happy to be here today. I think the intersection of the social component with our built environment is key. I think the intersection of the special needs of our circumpolar north communities and their reliance on the land is key. I hope you all had a chance to experience that, and understanding that, you know, we have an extra burden, I think, here in the circumpolar north and a challenge to meet. So happy to be here. Thanks, everybody.